King's Day across the nation, with estimates of more than 1 million protesters taking to the streets to protest the Trump administration. 2 such protests took place in Watertown. I stopped by both and spoke with protesters. They started on Arsenal Street. Hundreds of protesters raising signs and waving flags for passing cars.
We're supposed to be a democracy and we're a authoritarian oligarchy right now.
This is just one out of what the Associated Press reports to be about 2,600 protests taking place nationwide. They're all part of the No Kings movement, which stands in peaceful opposition to the Trump administration.
Their message of hate is totally 100% against what Jesus is all about.
About 300 people turned up to the protest on Arsenal Street. Motives varied, but a key theme among protesters was a call for tolerance.
I think we all have arms and legs and heads and mouths that we can talk, and we should all be treated equally. And people have the right to express what they want as individuals.
Another protest kicked off about an hour later on Public Square. It was a lot bigger, with organizers estimating it surpassed June's No Kings protest.
For one, I served this country, and this is America, and we have a democratic republic. We do not have a monarchy. And so, by default, as an American, your position should be no kings.
President Trump's deployment of the National Guard in cities like Chicago and Los Angeles was a driving force for some.
A big one is just the overreach of federal troops against citizens is a huge one for me.
But the one thing just about every protester talked about was ICE and the organization's treatment of migrants.
We literally are founded on immigrants, and we are discriminating so much against them. It's just ridiculous.
People are doing jobs that nobody else wants to do, and without them, I don't even know how we would get by. I don't know how we have food, and I can't understand the hatred and the injustice that's going on right now.
Similar No Kings Day protests were also held in Potsdam and Lowville. Chad Charette, 7 News.